Welcome to HarmonyTALK, a podcast of conversations with dreamers and doers, people who achieve a dream, sometimes against great odds. We chat with individuals from every arena: sports, music, art, science, social impact, business, and more. This podcast is brought to you by AM Skyer, a third-generation family insurance business started in 1920. I'm your host, Lisa Champeau. My guest today is Laurie Stuart, publisher of The River Reporter, a weekly community newspaper founded in 1975, 50 years ago this year. The River Reporter is based in Narrowsburg, New York, in the foothills of the Catskills. Laurie and her then-husband, Glenn Pontier, joined the paper in 1977 and took it over a short time later. What started out as a 4-page membership publication today publishes more than 35 pages per issue, covers 60 communities in 2 states, New York and Pennsylvania, and can be found online and in hundreds of retail outlets. The River Reporter has always presented itself as a kind of forum for ideas and civic dialogue. While its history has definitely encountered controversy over the decades, the paper continues to survive, thanks in large part to our guest, Laurie Stuart. Around the country, community newspapers are, frankly, a dying breed, and I don't think that's a surprise to many people. According to a 2024 report from the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University, the country has lost more than a quarter of its newspapers since 2005. By 2023, over half of all U.S. counties had limited access to local news, creating what has commonly been referred to as news deserts. How and why has the River Reporter managed to stay alive? Laurie, who is also an ordained Unitarian minister, joins us from Narrowsburg. Welcome, Laurie, and thanks for being with us. Congratulations on 50 years, quite a milestone.
Yes, thank you. It is a milestone. Miracle, some might say.
Yeah. Well, we'll get into that part. Laurie, you were a singer and an artist, as I understand it, when you and your husband joined the River Reporter. Since then, you have become a true advocate for local journalism. How did that spark ignite in you? What was it about the River Reporter that drew you to make it your life's mission?
Well, sometimes people choose things and sometimes things choose people. And so I do believe that the River Reporter chose me. But I also would say that I was the co-editor of my high school newspaper and the editor of the literary magazine at high school. I had thought that I would publish small books. I'm really interested in publishing. And when I was a senior in college, I came to Narrowsburg and met Tom DeGaetani. And Tom DeGaetani was the first managing director of Lincoln Center. He was an art consultant, high-powered art consultant, UNESCO School of Juilliard board. And he had had a heart attack at the age of 49. And his doctors in New York City told him to get out of town. And so he moved to his A-frame along the river. And it was right when the town of Tustin, where Narrowsburg, the hamlet of Narrowsburg is, was having a play. And so he got involved in a play. And what had happened was that the newspaper in Narrowsburg, the Delaware Valley News, had been sold. And it had been sold to John Dyson of the Eagle paper. So at any rate, John was trying to keep both papers alive, couldn't, and had a serious accident on 652. So he moved the Delaware Valley News to the Eagle, and it became the News Eagle. So folks from Holly,
Which is in Pennsylvania,
will remember the News Eagle. Well, Narrowsburg was very upset about that they lost their newspapers. So when Tom was hanging out with the people in the play, he found that there were community mothers and fathers who were interested in starting a newspaper. Tom had in his mind that he would like to start an art service organization. So he started the River Reporter in 1975, and he started the Delaware Valley Arts Alliance in 1976. He thought he could use the newspaper to publicize the beginning of his art center. And unfortunately, he did not change his lifestyle. And so he actually died of a heart attack in 1978. But Christmas Vacation of 1977, as a singer-songwriter, went to the Delaware Valley Arts Alliance to audition and to also talk about how I wanted to publish small books. And Tom theoretically found me an internship at Delaware Publications, which was a letterpress shop that had housed the paper, the original paper. And he booked me and Glenn, who was a storyteller, to perform at Harmony Hall in February. Made Glenn the assistant editor because it was actually Tom and his wife, Elaine Jaguar, who were running the paper and the Arts Alliance. So in 1978, he died. Went out to his car and just died suddenly of a heart attack. So he had made Glenn the assistant editor, and there we were.
But it sounded like it was kind of an arts vehicle to begin with, more than news per se.
I mean, he set up the Arts Alliance as an arts service organization with panels and that kind of thing. But the newspaper really was just, was a community newspaper. And he set it up as a membership organization, came out every other week and, covered when the medical center came in, when the area was added to the Wild and Scenic River system, all of those community conversations, it really did. And that's what we continued to do. Just covering whatever the local news was with columns from community columnists.
Well, you certainly took it from a membership publication of a couple of pages to a bigger tabloid. And I'll just show for a second. Not everybody can see video, but it is a tabloid size publication, and it definitely covers the news and the arts today. But just going back for the history a little bit, I mean, it was shortly after you and your husband took over the paper that you were kind of had a few controversies there. You mentioned the Delaware Wild and Scenic, and there was also a landfill, I think, issue. Tell us about that a little bit and how the paper managed to keep its balance.
Well, early on, there had been in Narrowsburg, there was a dump, not unlike other places where people would take their trash. And it was called the Cortez landfill. And it's actually right in the hamlet of Narrowsburg. And earlier, before we started with the paper, there had been talk about how the landfill operator was accepting waste from New Jersey. And so there were town board members that were very concerned about this. It was coming in at night and maybe drums of stuff were being dumped.
You mean toxic? Toxic stuff?
Yeah, toxic. And so actually one of the town council folks, Ed Krause, who was really tracking it, came and spoke to Glenn, who was the editor, and brought in all of his paperwork and that kind of thing. So the first very, very large story that the River Reporter did was the story of the Cortez landfill and how they were bringing in industrial waste from New Jersey. Actually, the landfill has become a federal Superfund site. It closed after that, and it's still being monitored today.
But the reaction to that story, what was the reaction? Because as I understand it, it wasn't all, oh, great, let's get rid of this dump.
Yeah, no, it was very interesting because, Main Street was a lively place. I mean, this was 1978. So in one sense, Narrowsburg has always been a very, very vibrant hamlet, really. But in 1964, when the train stopped, used to be on the New York line, right? And visitors would come up for the weekend, and there were taxis and boarding houses where people would come for the summer. But when the train went away, that stopped. And that was also, if you kind of remember the mid 60s, that's when airline travel really took off and people going to Disneyland, right? In California, there wasn't a Disney World yet. So the area then by the late 70s, it was really on a very much decline. But nonetheless, there was a lovely pizzeria, funky pizzeria called the C&C Cafe on Main Street. And what could be referred to as the good old boys used to be in the back booth right by the bathroom. And I can remember after we published the Cortez landfill story, kind of walking by that table and having the then supervisor, Dick Baling, kind of go, someone ought to replace those people. Remember if I said it or thought it, and we were working for free. It was kind of I think I might have in my mind go, well, find some other sucker to do it then.
Yeah, right.
But at any rate, no, it was not, because it really was anytime a newspaper kind of reveals some kind of community secret, it will have mixed reactions. There'll be people that are really glad for it. And there'll be people that are not really wanting that kind of thing to come out, which is kind of where newspapers are. It really does start a conversation. That's what makes for healthy community.
Well, let's just jump forward a little bit. The management of the Upper Delaware region by the U.S. Park Service, that was also another huge, you survived the Cortez landfill. But tell us about that story, because as I understand it, there was eminent domain, there were protests. What was the story? What was going on there?
So the story of the river being added to the Wild and Scenic River system, that's where it starts, and it starts in 78. Earlier in the 60s, there was a plan for what is now known as the Middle Delaware, and that was the building of the Tox Island Dam. Army Corps of Engineers was going to build a dam below Milford. They did use eminent domain, and people lost their family homes or had to give them up. And in the end, there was no dam that was built. And the river was added to the Wild and Scenic River system. The people in what is now known as the Upper Delaware were very, very, very concerned that what had happened in Tox Island would happen to them. As it turns out, it was Congress that created a very special designation for the Upper Delaware, which indicated that this would be a partnership between the towns and townships, towns in New York, townships in Pennsylvania. It would be a public-private collaboration and no land. It was very, very specific. That was a very, very small amount of land that the Park Service could actually acquire. Like, for instance, they could acquire like 2 acres for their headquarters. But everything else was going to be managed by a river management plan and an Upper Delaware Council. That's what the law said. That's what it was. And what happened was that the canoe liveries, and they were very popular in the 60s, back in the day that some of us, from New Jersey and New York would remember WABC and Cousin Brucey. That's where they were advertising, for people to come to the Upper Delaware to canoe. It was a bit of the Wild West with lots of people drinking and peeing on people's lawns and, things like that. Anyway, the canoe liveries got very concerned that they would need to become concessionaires, like in a national park. But this was not a national park. This was a National Park Service unit. They had no plans to take over. But when the first rangers came in 1980, they formed citizen advisory committees. They formed a river management team to write a river management plan. And at the same time, the canoe liveries actually brought in a man. His name was Charles Cushman. He was the president of the Innholders Association, which is an association of people who live in national parks. Basically an outside agitator. The outside agitator filled the valley with misinformation. They told people that their houses would be bought. They wouldn't be able to put in handicapped ramps. They would have to paint their house a certain color. So that was going on. The other thing that was going on is that the first superintendent of the park really believed that mission of private and public. And so what he did is he sought out people, local folks, who were paying a lot of attention and asked them to be part of the process. So one of those people was Glenn Pontier and Ed Wesley and David Holz, people who were associated with the people.
I know that Elaine Gigere, you mentioned her earlier, she said the River Reporter had a big role to play in keeping people informed about what was and what was not true. And even in your telling this story, I can hear there were a lot of untruths out there. Did the River Reporter become a target of some kind?
Yes, absolutely. So what happened was, and then the other thing that was confusing is Glenn and I met at Camp Spears El Jabbar YMCA, and we're both very good canoeists. And the River Reporter was absolutely paying us no money. So for one summer, Glenn was an interpretive ranger for the National Park Service. And it was his job when the Chinese dignitaries came and they took them on the river that Glenn was supposed to get them down the river without swamping, which he did. So there was a lot of confusion in people's minds in terms of what kind of role the paper and the people who worked for the paper, were playing. But what did happen was the River Reporter countered a lot of the misinformation that was going on. In fact, Ed Wesley went to the Cuyahoga Valley to kind of talk to them because one of the propaganda films that the agitator was using had to do with the Cuyahoga in Ohio. So at any rate, and we did these who are these guys kind of stories. And the River Reporter absolutely became a target. First, for economic boycott. People went around and said, do not advertise in this newspaper. And, the independent spirit of folks who live in the Upper Delaware kind of said, well, don't tell me what to do, right? So it wasn't particularly successful. Then what happened was on August 24th, 1986, Glenn and my home burned down.
It burned down. Was it arson?
So there was a man from Damascus, LaRue Elmore, who was a representative from Damascus. And because the house burned down and because this was a federal project, LaRue really involved the FBI to come and investigate whether it was arson or not. There was nothing conclusive that was necessarily found. I mean, the house burned to the ground. There was nothing left of it.
I take it you were not in the house at the time, hopefully.
No, we had gone to a play. Joseph Papp had brought a Mexican village to the town of Thompson Park. So we were there. We learned about it because as we were coming home, we saw the tanker from Lake Huntington go by and there was no fire trucks at the lava firehouse. We pulled over, being the newspaper people, where's the fire?
Was that your house?
And he said, Grassy's not road. And we like, which house? And they said, the second one. And that's saying, we said, that's our house.
That was quite a personal toll. I mean, how did you and Glenn interpret it at the time? Did you interpret it as a political kind of retribution, or did you see it just as an accident?
Oh, no. We definitely saw it that it was arson. The fire whistle was out. We were living pretty public lives. We were not home. You would bet we're at that Mexican village, presentation.
That
Live
liberal
horse,
Joseph Papp
from
thing.
Mexico, And then after that, too, there was some odd. We had just run a editorial. This is where became a little tiny bit personal. We had run an editorial in July about people moving to the country and what the United States means. And in that, there was mention that my maternal grandmother was a German Jew who came to this country in 1938, kind of escaping Hitler. And following the fire, there was actually some anti-Semitic flyers around. So it did feel very personal.
So how did you survive that? I mean, we're talking years ago now, and you're still standing tall and running the River Reporter. Where'd you go from there?
Well, as it turned out, Glenn's parents had bought a second home in Tustin. So we immediately, there it was. My son was 3. It was a really tough time. Anyway, so by that evening, we were at Glenn's parents' house. The following 2 days, it was like so many people dropped off bags of clothes. I had the Salvation Army in that basement. When you have that kind of trauma, you don't realize your loss like right away. I can remember a friend of mine coming and I was like, hey, I found this banjo at the dump and it has the same finish as my guitar. Oh my goodness, my guitar is gone. You don't really put it together. I really did have the experience of understanding how a person might just start screaming and not stop.
Or just give up, too. I mean, but it sounds like maybe it increased your fervor to publish.
Well, I can remember saying to myself maybe that first week or even the day after, I could put this together, but if it happens again, then I'm done.
It didn't happen again,
It
fortunately,
did
as I
not
understand.
happen again, but you get through it. I organized shoveling. I mean, there was nothing left. It had been a beautiful 1900s farmhouse on the middle of 3 acres on a secluded road. the realtor actually brought in it. She was putting it in the paper and she brought it in like on production day and we read the ad and we were like, we want to see this house. And so she said, when? And we said, right this instant. Because it was this 1900s farm. It was 3 sunny acres, new roof, new septic system, this is 1984, $26,000. So we were able to get this house, but then we were so underinsured because what did we know about insurance? It took 3 times as much the insurance to actually build the house back. And just as an interesting side story, because the house was in immaculate condition, the only thing we needed to do was paint the outside. We hosted a painting party. This is back in 84, 2 years before it burned. And somebody, Marcy Smith, took pictures of everybody like all over the house, but they were slides. And so one day she came into the office and she handed me those slides. I didn't have a slide protector. I threw them in my desk drawer. When the house burned, the slides became our most prized possession. And my brother, who was an architect, we rebuilt the house.
Well, that's good to hear. And you stuck around. And so let's fast forward a bit. That was a big challenge. I'm sure you've had other challenges since. But just keeping the paper alive, we talked about the decline of small community newspapers for a lot of reasons: a decrease in readership, changes in readership habits, a decline in advertising, the rise of online outlets, difficulty finding staff, and so on. Have you seen all of this at the River Reporter?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
How do you, for example, finding staff? I mean, that's huge.
We hire talented journalists, not unlike your lovely daughter, Liz. No one will.
That's true. She did work there at one time.
I want to just connect a little tiny bit, which is that fire created an enormous amount of stress, not unlike trauma. And it really was the beginning of the decline of Glenn and my marriage. And in 1985, Glenn had convinced my mom, he wanted to take the paper weekly, and he had convinced my mom to purchase it and give it some money. So that's when we went weekly in 85. And so at any rate, it really did start a tremendous amount of trauma and kind of was the beginning of the marriage ending. And because my mother had owned it, that's how it is that I kind of came into needing to be the sole person who watched over the River Reporter, which was not how it was in the beginning. But I really did see that shutting the paper was just a failure. And for some reason, I am determined. I became very determined to not fail in that way. And then interesting, I'd love to connect it. So for me, it's about creating community dialogue. It's about connecting people. And that really fit into my talents and passion and vocation around communication. So I then was keeping the paper going, but then realized it was a community ministry for me, and then went to seminary so that I would get better tools. The conversation around the conflict of the Park Service was not really quite as respectful and nuanced as it could have been. And in the end, everybody did. Like the people who were against the Park Service, the people who were for the Park Service, they were all about how much they loved this area and how they really had kept it protected.
So you actually joined the ministry in part to help that community come together a little bit better.
Yes, absolutely. And often, when things get celebrated, I said, listen, if there's anyone that can let live and forget and work together, even if you've experienced trauma, it's me. It is me.
Right. You've done a lot of other things too, though, I might add. You've joined other newspapers in seeking relief in many ways, some of them quite innovative. For example, New York's payroll tax credit. Tell us about some of the things that you've done at the state and maybe with your colleagues at the national level just to try to keep newspapers thriving.
Well, newspapers are challenged. And there really are, at this moment in time, 4 different, you need to kind of build a stool with 4 legs: advertising, reader support, governmental support, and philanthropy. That's what you need right this instant to keep it going. And specifically, local papers are tasked with connecting people around local issues. So I have been a board member of the New York Press Association through the years. I've run regional discussions called the Upper Delaware River Roundtable. We accomplished a lot through that. There's a new coalition, the Empire State Local News Coalition, and they were really pushing New York State to create a fund to help local newspapers sustain jobs. The interesting thing about a local newspaper is that really all of the money is all local. It's all spent locally. It creates jobs. It's this amazing machine that supports local. So I did advocate for this idea. For me, it's always been about community. And it is interesting how newspapers, when they used to make money, were much more about business. But it's very interesting as that business model is getting squeezed. Most newspaper publishers, particularly local ones, are really going back to mission. And that mission is providing people with the news that they need. And I, because of going to seminary, because of what I hold in my heart, the dream that I have, that people, when they understand the issues, can really come up with very creative solutions, especially if they don't get along. So there is a jobs bill. It's not enough money, but theoretically next year there will be some tax relief for newspapers for full-time journalists' jobs.
They'll give you a tax credit. Is that what you're referring to?
Well, they'll actually give you the money whether you paid in or not.
So, with all of these efforts that are going on in your passion and your ministry and so on, how is the River Reporter doing? I mean, have any of these efforts succeeded? Do you see a growth? Do you get any positive feedback? I mean, where is the River Reporter today in terms of what we're talking about?
In terms of what we're talking about, the River Reporter is incredibly strong. We are very well seen, well respected in the community. I think the longevity of my 47 years on the job, our attitude toward, pluralistic ways that diverse people can be communicating and participating in community. What we do need is more people to be subscribing to the newspaper. What we do need is to make sure that newspapers, and particularly the River Reporter, are really solidly embedded in the community, that they are important to people. We're running a youth section like once a month. We're running sustainability. We're leading these conversations. These are all essential. Money is a challenge. But if you didn't have those other things, you would have a much bigger challenge. Many industries are in disruption. We're all going to need to figure out how together in local community, we figure it out and support everyone and make an environment where everyone belongs and has a purpose. But I believe that local community can do it, and particularly ours, with the layers and layers and layers that through the decades have been the collaborations.
Well, research does show that 85% of U.S. adults say local news outlets are at least somewhat important to the well-being of their local community. You have a print edition and you have online, and a lot of people have turned to online. So when you say subscribe, are you talking about to the print or both, or do you think the print edition has a life?
Either. And in fact, we're running a summer sale on digital subscriptions, half price.
And I know not everybody can see this interview, but you are wearing a little button that says "Read Local," the River Reporter. So you are still out there promoting something I ask almost every guest in their field. If you had to give advice today to a young journalist, what would it be?
I think it's important for actually everyone to find their unique voice.
Within journalism, and you mean within your writing, within journalism?
Yeah, and what you're interested in and why it is that you want to spend your life, in one sense, documenting information for other people, gathering information, in one sense, holding your dream that we all have access and agency to make our communities more resilient.
Well, thank you very much. That's a wonderful parting note, to be perfectly honest with you. And I wish you the best of luck with the future, and happy 50th.
Thank you. Thank you. If I could say one more thing, Newsies is playing at the Forestburg Playhouse, and there's a Newsy Night, River Reporter Newsy Night, which is Thursday, August 7th.
All right, that's great for people who live in the area or might be visiting. Well, thank you so much, Laurie, for being with us here on Harmony Talk. This podcast is brought to you by A.M. Skyer, a third-generation family insurance business started in 1920. Talk to you next time.